Hello everybody and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope we're doing well. And today we'll be doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw The Beekeeper of all films actually take the #1 spot from Mean Girls in one of the worst domestic weekends we've had in quite a while, as there are no major wide releases this weekend. Much of the blame, of course, is always going to be going to the writer strikes and the actor strikes from last year, as we know Tony is always liking to do, but it's also because of the films that are actually out right now and just how much lack of quality there actually is. And I think one great example of this is the fact that Godzilla Minus One, which is a phenomenal film and one of the best films of last year, got a re-release, or I guess a reintroduction as it were, and roughly 500 screens this week in a black and white new version, and that film had probably the best per theater ratio for the number of screens that it actually had. So ultimately what that means is that people will indeed go see the movies. They'll indeed give their money to go see a film. However, it needs to actually be good and actually worth going to see. And so we'll talk about that and how really The Beekeeper and Mean Girls aren't really matching up to that, as well as a correction and explanation of what happened last weekend with the coverage of The Beekeeper and a couple other things. Before going any further, though, please make sure you smash that like button, light up that fire button on Odyssey, and smash the rumble button as well. Also, make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification. That way you know every time a video or live stream goes live on the channel. So first off, a blessed Septuagesima, 70 days before Easter. Beautiful tradition here in the church, especially with the Latin Mass tradition. But I first want to start off by saying, make sure that you check out my box office breakdowns over at geeksandgamers.com. I had my first one up this past week talking about how Mean Girls was easily beating newcomer ISS and went through a bunch of other things. And so if you think that the videos tend to be a little bit long, or you want to have something to actually visually look at that might be easier to digest, I would say go ahead and check out my articles over at geeksandgamers.com. Really great website, really great coverage of a lot of different topics, especially if you are following anything within pop culture and related things. And of course, I will have a breakdown written up later today and either posted either sometime today, Sunday, or tomorrow, as a shout out to Alex, who is awesome over there on the website, keeping up with that. But just wanted to give that a quick plug. But The Beekeeper, indeed, as Tony, with his usual amazingness, says The Beekeeper looks to sting Mean Girls during woeful weekend without wide releases. And of course, that is the big thing. The other thing, too, and this is something that I'm mentioning in my article for Geeks and Gamers, is this is also the month where movies go to die, right? This has been notoriously the case for a long time, and a big part of that is actually because of the studios. The studios, having put out most of their films at the tail end of a given year, tend not to have a whole lot of films ready, and also in their own minds think, well, people aren't going to go see these movies anyway. But it really is kind of this self-defeating thing, because if you don't release big films, people don't go see the films, and therefore Disney, or rather, sorry, in this case, January, of course, Disney doesn't do well here either, but January ends up becoming the month where films go to die, where it just is always going to be said as such. But we obviously have examples, even from just the past few years, that have shown to be successful and have actually been able to send new films into the stratosphere in some cases, because it actually had good word of mouth, it actually had effective marketing, and it actually was able to, get people out there because of the fact that it was actually well made. So that's only a part of the story, and I always like to call out when Tony and other, so-called experts of the box office like to, again, focus strongly on that and like to give a lot of, let's just say, excuses to the movie studios, amongst other things, and so it has to, of course, be mentioned. Now, what is interesting, of course, is that this weekend also saw a massive release of old films. So because of the Oscar nominations that just came out this past week, much more importantly, the Raven Award nominations came out this week. Make sure to check out the website OMBReviews.com to get access to not only a list of the nominations for the Raven Awards, but also a ballot so that you can vote for the best and worst for the year 2023, and not just the nonsense that the Oscars put forward. But they did obviously increase some of the showings of some of their other films, like American Fiction got a wider release, and of course, other films came back to theaters in certain respects. It says how Barbenheimer and Oscar Best Pick noms fared at the box office. So we won't go too much into this article here from Tony, because Tony is Tony. It says, boring weekends always make for intense times at the box office. And this morning, Amazon MGM's Beekeeper is looking to steal Paramount's Mean Girls' Honey in a third weekend call of $7.4 to $7.3 million. Now, of course, we will find out after the weekend whether or not, this film actually was able to beat it. These are just based off of the estimates. Sometimes studios like to play heavy-handed and try to project just to get that number one spot, even just for a little bit, to be able to talk about and be able to brag about to shareholders or whatever else it might be. But the fact is that the 1-2 punch is looking to be between The Beekeeper and also for Mean Girls as well. Going into the box office itself, as we can see right here, over at thenumbers.com, The Beekeeper had a 14% drop from last week. So it increased 7 theaters and only dropped 14%. So that's a very strong hold. There is just no bones about that. It is doing very well in its day-to-day performance, doing very well, or a lot better, I should say, in its weekend performance. Now, I'll say this right now. A lot of people were pointing out saying, The Beekeeper actually did a lot better than what you had said last weekend, and that was because the international numbers, had not yet updated. So some films, especially from studios that are not really quick to report things, amongst other things, don't often, necessarily get all the numbers up to date. By the time I record these, around 1:30 to 2 p.m. Eastern time. Most films do. In the case of Beekeeper, it's one of those rare exceptions where it actually does not. So the Beekeeper's numbers were not actually up to date, whereas it was actually up to date on Deadline and other places at that point because of reports that they had been getting in. That all being said, that's the reason why the numbers indicated what they did. I still hold to many of the same things that I said about the film, though, because I obviously have not seen the film, so I can't say whether the film is bad or not. But why I think this film financially is just not going to be much of a moneymaker and actually might end up still being a financial loss is because when you do like a full breakdown, right, when you look into the fact that this film has a split between domestic and international to such a degree that higher international number is actually going to end up meaning, because they get a lot less back from that, meaning the film, based on whatever the budget actually is for this movie, and please stop sharing, the movie cost $34 million because that's what Google told me. If you actually look at the resource on that, it comes from a random site run in India and is not reliable whatsoever. It doesn't mean that that's not actually going to end up necessarily being the budget, because obviously random sites can sometimes be right on occasion, but there is nothing credible at this point indicating how much money this movie actually cost to be made. And so because of that, the profitability of the film is still going to be a question mark. But even if it is that $34 to $40 million number that many people are speculating, it's still in a position where, because it has so much investment, or rather so much money coming from the overseas markets, it still has a little ways to go to actually break even. Now, this is a good move for them, right? This is, as far as a performance goes, a very good performance. This is the kind of numbers that they want to see. Very, very small drops off in the domestic market where they get a much larger share of those overall profits. But especially with the fact that we do have some competition coming out over the next couple of weeks, this might be short-lived. But we'll have to, of course, wait and see whether The Beekeeper is able to hold out in the long run. Mean Girls is in the number 2 spot this week, 37% drop there. 282 screens have been dropped. As I mentioned with this movie, the film by itself on paper is doing okay, but has that similar problem as Beekeeper, where the profitability is kind of going to be up in the air based off that domestic versus international split. What we can absolutely say, though, is that this Mean Girls is still now $30 million behind the original film when you actually adjust for inflation and compare like-for-like dollars. Especially when you compare the average ticket sales for both of these movies, this film is clearly not going to be anywhere near where the original film ended up by the end of its run. Third film, once again hanging around, still with insane drops after 7 weeks of release. So for The Beekeeper, very strong, having a third week performance of a 14% drop. For Wonka, though, to have a 12% drop after 7 weeks of release, still out at over 3,000 screens. I mean, let's just say that is very impressive. This film, again, marching towards $200 million domestic. This film also, though it had a huge portion of its box office coming from the internationals, it's gotten enough from the domestic, had a small enough budget, and also made enough money in the right places internationally where it is now continuing to add to its overall profits. So kudos to Warner Brothers for actually having a profitable movie for once. Migration from Universal at $5.1 million, a 6% hold there. So 6 weeks out from its initial release. Definitely very good numbers. And Anyone But You, also 11% drop. I think this is also showing to us why when you have new wide releases, sometimes these drops are a lot bigger, because obviously all the eyes, all the attention are on those brand new films. People that maybe would have thought about going to a movie theater on a given weekend would have been, focused on going to one specific thing, but then the new film could have easily grabbed their attention. So because of that, I think that's probably why we're seeing these levels of drops where they're all very low, right? All these films are holding very strong, but a strong hold itself does not guarantee financial viability or success, because it all depends on what are you holding from, right? If you have one of the worst opening weekends of all time, but then you hold strong after the fact, you could have some crazy insane holds after your first 2 weeks, but still end up losing money because of your budget, marketing, etc. as is the case with films like Aquaman and The Lost Kingdom, for instance, where its main problem is that it's making the vast majority of its money overseas, with a huge portion of it coming from China, in addition to a massively bloated budget, which means the film's going to end up still at a $100 million loss, even though after 6 weeks, it's only had a 23% drop. So hopefully, again, you can see why these numbers are important and why you have to understand these things within the full context of everything going on. You did, of course, have some wider releases of films that got nominated, so that's why Poor Things is now in the top 10 this week. American Fiction also, which actually is a pretty good film that I enjoyed up until the ending, which got a little bit too crazy to me. But as I mentioned in the beginning, right, Godzilla Minus One, 276% increase, same number of theaters from the previous week, 4,800 per screen. So very impressive per theater ratio there, especially for the films in the top, in this case, top 10. And the fact that it had a better per theater ratio, meaning that the theaters were a lot more crowded for Godzilla Minus One's black and white showing, still a Japanese, language movie, over films like Beekeeper and Mean Girls, also, I think, hopefully shows why I keep saying that the numbers for Beekeeper and Mean Girls are not nearly as strong as what some people might think or might be actually indicating. Going into the individuals, as of the recording of this video, right now the Beekeeper is reporting at $86.4 million. Obviously, we'll have to keep this updated throughout the day, but as I mentioned before, even if, let's say, it adds another $10 million internationally, that would still be $42 versus $54 million. 40% of its cut comes from the international markets, on average. And the Beekeeper, domestically, we're looking at roughly 50 to 55% take in that instance. And so what we have here then is it's making the money in the wrong places. And though the strong holds could eventually lead to it being able to hit its break even, be able to actually make profit. And obviously on my charting, it's getting very close to hitting break even. Just remember that that's looking at it with the most conservative viewpoint possible and not likely what the current standards actually are. And again, if you want more information about my methodology and where I come from, check out the other articles that I've written on geeksandgamers.com that kind of go into that. Mean Girls is now at $76 million. And again, this film now $30 million. So at the same point of release, the original Mean Girls had crossed about $100 million at the same time. So Mean Girls is slowing down quite a bit. Clearly, this had a very specific audience in mind, but at the same time, it still cost enough money to where it needed to make money in certain places, and it needed to make enough of it to actually justify its own existence. Right now, not looking like that's going to be the case. Wonka, over $500 million, $552 million, continuing to add on to it. It's going to be well over $200 million domestically by the end of its run. So very cool to see this film, which actually was not bad. It was okay. It was decent, as I have on my Critic List score. Check me out over at Critic List. And I think that this is, again, very cool to see this happen. Migration, $206 million. So again, not the biggest moneymaker in the world for Illumination, but definitely at a point where they were probably looking to be pretty happy. Anyone But You, the surprise movie, as you can see, even just from the charting, based on its opening weekend, this film should have only been around $22 million at best. But over the last 5 years, at least comparing to that, it's at $71 million domestic. So again, kudos to them for being able to get the word of mouth out there. And then Godzilla Minus One, well over $100 million now worldwide. Very happy to see this film continuing to do as well as it is. Going into the charting, because we love doing charting here over at OMB Reviews, you'll notice that I didn't mention anything really about ISS, because this film, though it was a brand new release last weekend, didn't make anything, right? It made $3.1 million in its opening weekend, and now after 2 weeks has only made it to $5.5 million, meaning that I'm projecting this film to end somewhere between $7 million, and actually I need to update this number real quick. I always like to double check to make sure. There it is. So somewhere between 7.9 and 11 million, on average around $9.5 million. Something tells me, based on the numbers that we're seeing, probably going to be towards the lower end of that scale, maybe even a chart breaker in the negative direction. It did cost $13.8 million, which is still enough to where this film likely will end up being a $15 million flop. So not the biggest loss for them, but hey, still money lost nonetheless. Book of Clarence also not making much of anything compared to its first 2 weeks. It's now been out for a few. Has only made, the first 2 weeks account for 84% of its entire box office. So this film clearly not making much of anything. At $5.5 million, this film is still $56 million in the red. Likely will end up being well over a $50 million flop for that movie. Now, as I mentioned with The Beekeeper, the projections from last week, again, based off those numbers, I was able to update those to indicate that it's looking to make somewhere between $4.5 and $30 million based off of that $40 million budget, which again is not yet confirmed at this point. And even that lower $34 million is especially not yet confirmed, because the only sites reporting it are ones that have no real credibility. just random websites that are just claiming that that's what the budget is, but no one else actually seems to have that information at this point. But all that being said, based off of the traditional charting, this film is definitely on pace to be able to hit that break even. But as I mentioned, because of its larger amount coming from the international audiences, that does mean that using that, random crazy charting, as I like to call it, probably will still not end up making its money back based off of what we're seeing right now. Mean Girls as well, as again, traditionally, you see this film is getting close to a break even, still nothing close to the original film, and still because of that split, just like with The Beekeeper, might not end up making its money back either. Night Swim has been able to make its money back. Boys in the Boat is again continuing its run where it's getting some attention from awards, and so it's making some here and there, but still looks to be a flop. Ferrari, $100 million flop still. Color Purple, obviously still a flop as well. This film just not doing anything whatsoever. Migration, now $15.6 million in profit. So even if you take that split, this film right now tracking probably to where, even if you take the international split from it, it'll probably still end up being close to that break-even point. Still, I think I would say this is probably overall a disappointment for Illumination. Not really a whole lot here to start a new franchise off of, which seems to be the name of the game when it comes to a lot of the films coming from them, especially from their animated space. And as many people have been talking about, have been focusing on, what is going on with Aquaman, right? $400 million is still well below the original film's $1 billion plus. It's still also, even on the most conservative side of things, a $59 million flop. And even though the film is holding from week to week domestically and certainly, in some places internationally, I think that we can still say, yeah, that 50 plus million it got from China, though, it got 25% of that, 40% from everywhere else internationally, and that's where the bulk of its money is coming from. This film likely going to be $100 plus million of a flop at that point. But those are the numbers as they stand. What are y'all's thoughts about this? Please let me know in the comment section down below. And also, again, check me out over at geeksandgamers.com if you want another box office breakdown with some more information. Any updated data, obviously, I will put on that article since I write that typically after the fact, or I'm in the process of writing it. And also, as I mentioned before, make sure to go to OMBReviews.com and get your votes in for the Raven Awards. Let me go ahead and see, actually, if I can pull that up for everybody. So as you can see, we have obviously over here, Raven Awards, click on that. And you have obviously the video stream here. You have the Google form here where you can fill out your ballot for the best and worst of the year. And then you have this little slideshow here where you can look and see what got best one-liner and quote of the year, what got best stunt work of the year, best animated movie of the year, right? Check out all the nominations for things like NPC of the year as well over at my website. You guys seriously are amazing. Make sure you smash that like button, line up that fire button on Odyssey, and smash the rumble button as well. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless. And now for a very special shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members, starting off with my Patreon Chosen members, Father Luca Illich, shout out to you, Father. Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel, Eagle Rider. And Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name. And to my Subscribe Star peeps, Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name. Mr. Roy and ZK-Man, check out his website, xtheboundaries.co. And if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, or if you want access to a giveaways channel on my Discord and plenty of other extra content as well, random crazy stuff out there, check out the YouTube memberships and other membership platforms in the top link in the video description below. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.